Maybe there's a sense in which global warming doesn't just apply to carbon emissions. Maybe things are stuck because we haven't found a way to release them, and we have no rituals of release. Um, so taking the slow time to lead us into this blowing across pixels and across space-time. Um, thank you. Thank you for doing that with us. Um, I want to just invite us now to play, okay? Yoruba people always expect during a ceremony, even one as serious and important as a burial, there is always the expectation of party rice. There's always music afterwards because death isn't negative. Death isn't a sore spot in the universe. Death is part of the mystery of how things gain, become finer, you know, take on new shapes. So I'm going to invite us to play now, but I want to just situate this invitation properly. I don't know if this applies to me alone. It's my experience. But I don't know if anyone here else, if anyone else, feels sometimes alien. If you feel, if you look at your fingers and you say, it's 5, I have 5. Why 5 and not 23? I don't know. I've had moments when I feel strange and things feel strange. And I wonder why I have one head instead of 10 or something. Like I don't want to call it an out of body experience since that is already taken, but it's almost like I'm viewing myself through some mirror and things feel strange. I see the tautness of my skin and the gradations and the hair on my arms. And I wonder, why? Maybe it's nerd stuff, but I think you know a bit about what I'm talking about, don't you? Um, there's a beautiful thinker called Baruch Spinoza, 17th century guy. And he had an important question that I want to share with you. The question is, what does the body do? Do we even know what the body is capable of? What affections, capacities, capabilities? What do we know about the body for real? I'm sure he didn't say for real in the 17th century, but I'm sure it was right in there. For real, what do we know about the body? Um, and I think this exploration of bodies is at the heart of what we're doing here. I'd just like to say this very quickly, that there is a sense in which we are aliens. We are constantly being shaped by the world around us, constantly being remolded by feathers and vestigial flags and and American flags draped on our, on our bodies and stuff like that. We're never as coherent or as put together as modernity thinks we are. So I'd like to just offer a very brief prompt. I was going to tell a story around this, but I'll save that for later. That think about all the ways that you are not yourself. Think about all the ways you are strange. And think about all the ways you are external to yourself, if you will. Um, Never quite appearing in the ways that habitual forms of perception um, might represent you. Um, and just write about it. Just, if you will, write. There's no sharing around that now, but you can share it in the Mighty Networks group. Um, Modernity has a way of thinking about the self, as Jordi and I were discussing recently, as a steady stream of selfhood that is interrupted once in a while by an event, when we become, when we step outside of ourselves, maybe we're angry or something. Those moments when we are not ourselves are usually pathologized. Um, we're usually given a bad name. Um, but I want you to write, if you will. Um, Write as if those were moments when the world interpenetrates you, when the world mounts you or possesses you. Um, write as if you were porous, as if identity is already riven with cracks and um, fissures and fault lines and ruptures and discontinuities. And share it with us. Thank you to all the aliens. I hope you have safe passage here on Earth. And I hope you find us interesting um, as you move around the world. At this point in time, I'd like us to maybe just take a deep breath. And I will say a few things about identity and whiteness. What the alien teaches me personally is that we live in excess of ourselves. Modernity tries to situate the self within the self. You're fully yourself and no other self. But there is a sense in which we need other bodies to navigate the complexity of the world. And we actually use other bodies to do that. We are not as encased or as solitary or as independent as has been told us. So we are alien and we're constantly being reconfigured again and again. So let me tell you a story about someone that I recently met, well, via the internet, not in real life. Karen, could you put the image of the Abanza on the screen? Thank you. Okay. Sure. This brother's name is Emery Nwazulu Diabanza. And he's an activist. I think he's about 41 years old. He's from Congo, grew up in Kinshasa. I did some of my growing up in Kinshasa as well. And he's an activist. He's an activist whose activism is premised almost entirely on the politics of restitution and reparations. What does that mean? Let me give you some context. So colonization wasn't just a transference of bodies across the Atlantic. It wasn't just the installation of worldviews. It wasn't just the sterilization of landscapes. It wasn't just the extraction of ancestors and progeny. It was also downright dirty. It was stealing. There was a lot of stealing that happened, especially in a country like Umwazulu Diabanza's Congo, which is colonized by Belgium. In those times, I think the 19th century, 18th century, colonial powers would literally take artworks, pilfer that and take it across the Atlantic, sell it to rich benefactors, and they would most likely end up in museums. In 1897, for instance, the British sent their army, some soldiers, to kill the king of Benin. And they took the Benin bronzes, famous, really famous artwork, which is now in the Louvre, the British Museum, and museums across the world. And there has been a politics, a desire to have them returned to us, returned to Africa. But there is a sense in which these museums are saying no. They're just like finders keepers, we're not giving you back. Recently, Emmanuel Macron, the leader of France, allowed for some of these things to be returned, but they haven't honored those commitments. In these museums are pieces of history, pieces of communities, that have been lost across time. So this brother here literally goes to these museums, and he does something really strange. So I have a small video. It's just 59 seconds, and I just want you guys to watch to see what he does. Um, Karen, could you do that for me? I think we need to pray more to the gods of Zoom. See if they would. Okay. From the beginning. Yes. Is your volume on? Is it sure?
Comme on ne demande pas ce qui a volé, nous tous ça fait. Donc on est venu récupérer ce qui nous appartient. Je suis venu répandre ce qui a été volé, ce qui a été pillé en Afrique. Au nom de notre peuple, au nom de notre mère patrie l'Afrique, au nom de tous ceux et toutes celles qui ont été violés, qui ont été massacrés, qui ont été humiliés, dont qui ont été brisés. Où est votre conscience? Savez-vous combien de femmes ont été violées? Savez-vous combien d'enfants ont été assassinés? Je rentre à la maison. Je rentre à la maison avec ce patrimoine qui a été volé, pillé dans notre chère et mère patrie l'Afrique. Pouvez-vous répondre à ces questions? Oui. Par quels moyens le musée de Louvre a pris ça? Des milliers d'enfants. L'Afrique entière a été détruite. L'Occident de manière générale a volé. L'Occident de manière générale a volé.
Non, je ne vous ai pas filmé.
Non, je le filme lui. Détruit de peuples entiers. Détruit des nations entières. Détruit de peuples. Détruit.
Thank you. Thank you. That's Mwazulu de Abanza doing what it does best, infiltrating museums across the world and taking it back. That's what he does. He attempts to take it back. He has never succeeded, though. He's never succeeded. He's under arrest right now in France and has just been arraigned before a court in Marseille, and is likely to be there for some time. Now, I was watching one of these videos. I've watched many videos of the Abanza, because I love him so much. And under one of these videos, you know, the comments in that YouTube section, someone said this, that, yeah, I mean, if Africans had these artifacts, they wouldn't know what to do with it anyway. I mean, it's likely to be lost, and it's not likely to be as preserved as it is. So we're actually doing you guys a favor. I don't like to comment on YouTube or the internet. I have better things to do with my time, but I like to respond here in two ways. That comment does not take into account, or the commenter does not take into account, the years of violence and destruction and incapacitation that rendered those communities listless. Without your totems, without your guides, those were not just pieces of art, they were spirits, ancestors. And to take them away is to take something deeply sacred, translate it into something much more intelligible to the modern. That commenter did not account for that. But more importantly, and this is a more nuanced response to that comment, where did we get the idea that if it's not preserved, it's not worth it? That it mustn't die, that it's not valuable if it's not preserved forever, that it needs to be preserved in a museum, that art is only accessible when it's seen, not when it's remembered, not when it's shared in community in a different way. That's what I'd have loved to say to that commenter. And that's what I'm sharing with us right now. But like most things, there's a third consideration here, a hidden one. And it's probably best seen than spoken about, but I will speak about it. Karen, could you go back to the video? This is evidence of something strange happening here. Go back to the video if you will.
It will take me a second because I didn't.
In a second,
I want to pull it up again.
Okay. That's about 20 seconds now.
Okay. I underestimated.
Okay, so when I say play, I just want everyone to train your eyes on the first few seconds of the screen. I'm just about to show you something. This is going to blow your mind.
Comme on ne demande pas ce qui a volé nous tous affaires. Donc on est venu
There,
récupérer ce
stop.
qui nous appartient.
There, stop. Pause it. Yes. Did you guys see it? Did everyone see it? No? No? Okay. I'll tell you what it is. It moved. The artifact moved. What? What are you talking about, Bayo? Of course it moved. You lifted it up from its perch. It moved, yes. What's so fascinating about that? Well, I don't care how it moved. My point here is this figure and its movement, especially by unauthorized hands, in molecular ways unsettled the paradigm of the museum. Now, the Abanza may not be a successful reef thief. He may not be a successful activist, but the generative insufficiency of his work will not be downplayed, especially when we notice that just the movement of the artifact, even if for a brief moment away from its perch, away from the place that had been assigned to it, is a moment of fugitivity. That something happened there, an error, the unruly errancy in the algorithm of the museum. Something happened. We can go back and watch it again. We can go back and watch it again. Just go back and just see it lift away. It might not impress you as much as it impresses me, but just take a look.
Donc on est venu récupérer ce qui nous appartient.
All right, pause it here. That's it. You can come back to your plenary now. Just its movement away from that perch, for me, is an upsetting of the modern order of things. Now, that might not be impressive to you. You might say, yeah, that doesn't really, I don't really see the potency of that. So maybe the next thing I'm about to say might impress you then, because I think that's really scandalous, that something we fix in place moves away from its place. In April 2020, one of the most serious publications in the world, The Economist, published a shocking essay, a report by a journalist, and it was titled, "Is the British Museum Haunted?" And it was about artifacts stolen and what they're doing to the museums. And the focus was on the British Museum, and it's about drops in temperature, doors that have been bolted around these pilfered objects, surprisingly opened by something, movements in the night that the security agents could not account for. Even veterans scared of moving into museums at night, walking through thousands of doors to see if these things are in place. One of my most interesting accounts is about a security guard walking past a Congolese object, the sculpture of a dog, a two-headed dog, much like our alien here. And he felt an overwhelming desire to point at this object. And so he slowly lifts his hand and points at it, and the alarms go off. Maybe a coincidence. And so he brings his brother the next day, and all of this is in that beautiful article, beautifully written and researched. He brings his brother the next day, and the brother lifts up his hand as well and points at the object, at this dog, and the alarms go off again. This article, I would encourage you to read it. It's replete with scary stories about objects moving away from their assignment, from their assigned perches in the museum. And this is what I want to point out here. That the Abanza's work allows me to theorize what I call restless bodies. Restless bodies. What's a restless body or a restless body scenario? A restless body scenario is when an object objects to its fixity, when the stolen steals away, right? Or when what we have assigned and designated is never fully contained or appropriated or extracted from. It's something allows it to move away from extraction, from it being fully owned. So here's what I want to point out here. That in a very, very powerful sense, the accusation of cultural appropriation is ethically justified in this right to say that these things have been stolen. I know for certain that the Nigerian government is trying to get back the Benin bronzes, which are called masterpieces of art. No one understands how these things were produced. But the assignment or the accusation of cultural appropriation actually works within the same conceptual order that gives meaning to the museum. So I want to be very, very slow as I explain this, that to say these things have been stolen is right within a conceptual framework. And our feelings about that are also justified. When we think about all that has been lost, it's justified. But there is another container of assumptions and understandings and experiments and questions. And that's the restless body aspect of what we're talking about today. That goes beyond cultural appropriation, that says to say this is cultural appropriation is right, but it's not sufficient to know what is happening. That there are other things happening here as well. And those are what I call restless bodies, when bodies spill, away from their algorithms, when they move, when they disturb the gravity of things. What kinds of questions are possible when we think through restless bodies? What does identity become in a world that spills and is open and is porous? A world that makes us alien just by touching us. I want to hold the tensions of these two. On one end, the accusation of cultural appropriation. And yet it is part of the museum, because even though you're against something, you can be very well entangled to it. You can be against or in opposition to something and still be part of what makes that something possible. You can still be part of its framework, part of its body, part of what gives it sense and value and meaning. And this is some of the very frightening ways that that activism will sometimes feed the world that it's trying to leave behind. But there is another sense in which things are doing things on their own, way beyond what humans can do. And then we can ask questions then. What if that two-headed dog is decolonizing or upsetting the colonial order? What is the world doing? What other forms of doing are afoot right now that we're not paying attention to? What is this body capable of doing? Okay. We'll take a break. I wanted to start this last bit of our time together by acknowledging this. You see, let's face it, we're not here to figure everything out. We're not going to figure everything out in a final sense. Most of us, if not all of us, are here because we want to live well. It's just that living well is hard, in an entangled world, because there is no living that is not a living with. We don't just live independently, we live with ideologies, we live with historical struggles, we live with bacterial activisms, we live with compost heaps, we live with colonial trauma. So there's a lot, and especially in these times, when the computational algorithms of social networks is an added complexity to how we live, it can be very difficult to make sense of this overwhelm. This course is not an invitation to get rid of the overwhelm. Making sanctuary is not about escaping overwhelm. It's not about changing the world in the sense of saving it. I don't think I have any desire to save the world. I used to. Um, and now I just noticed the hubris um, there in thinking that we can save the world. I think more than just thinking about the world as being savable, um, we notice that even the very concept of the world is an imperial concept, as if something, as if the world, language fails me, as if something could be known in some totalizing way, as if edges are so fixed that they could be totally consumed. Well, we're here because we are colonized bodies, we're colonizer bodies, and we're everything in between. To be colonizer and to be colonized is to occupy an increasingly small space. And now most of us are, if not all of us, I believe that's the reason why you're here. Most of us are feeling this tightening, this, this shrinking circle. Anxieties are increasing, despair, disenchantment. Our activisms don't seem to know a way out. Making sanctuary is what happens when something penetrates the bubble of relationships that we've been encased or quarantined in. It's when it's when an edge bursts open and something utterly inexplicably alien comes in, and we have to make sense of that. I want to speak about not just identity, but race and racialization and whiteness, and a theory of mine that I call transraciality. Um, I don't think I can get through this without some notes. So I've actually taken notes. I don't like notes. I like to just riff and play it like jazz. But I think this time um, I need I need some backup because of the things that I really feel I want to get through and say. Um, so let's go there. Keep in mind what we've just been talking about the alien, about identity, identity as this riven place, never fully showing up. We'll speak more about that. And how sometimes behind labels, molecular shifts are happening, that the world is constantly deterritorializing itself um, behind our social practices of naming ourselves, which is the reason why I love that Indian proverb. Name the color, blind the eye. Um, at the very moment we name ourselves, um, which is very important to do, um, we're taking certain risks that occludes other things from showing up. And let me get into it. I was in the United States. When was I in the United States? Yeah, last before the pandemic, I was almost always in the United States, teaching and traveling. And on one of those trips, I remember someone coming up to me and saying, "I really, really, Bayo, I really love your accent. That I love your accent." And I said, "Oh, thank you, thank you. Where did you learn how to speak English?" And school. I spoke well in school. I don't speak my own language very well, which is something still unfortunate. And then the person says, I wish I had an accent. And I'm usually very polite. I'm very polite most of the time because of the way I was brought up. But something in me wanted to scream, of course you do. You do have an accent. You have an accent. It's not default. There's no default way of speaking. And then other ways of speaking are deviations from that default. You have an accent. What I really wanted to say, but I think I said something like, yeah, okay, I just want to get back to my hotel room or something like that. But it was, what I really wanted to say was, of course you have an accent. And you see, maybe that event is a microcosm, a small case study of what, of the struggles, historical struggles to name whiteness as this universal tendency to seek default ground, foundational spaces, and name it for itself. And every other thing becomes a strain away from that defaultness, a negative space, wanting to come back to the foundationalism of whiteness. My reaction wasn't the first, of course. There have been many reactions and responses to white foundationalism. I would call in the Combahee River Collective, which is a Black feminist lesbian socialist organization in the United States, which in the 70s actually is credited with creating the terms or the term identity politics. Many people don't realize this, that identity is a relatively new concept. Not the word maybe, but the way it's used today, that it wasn't always that way, especially in the 70s when Black feminists insisted that white feminists were not giving them their due. This is where other concepts, related concepts like intersectionality derives. That look, we have experiences. We don't want to be, we don't all want to march under the banner of feminists. We insist that you understand the complexity of where we are coming from. And so this is the way that identity became part of our lexicon, part of our ways of speaking about the world. The Identity Project took off as a way of naming white foundationalism, as a way of saying, no, you have an accent as well, right? You are just as situated. In fact, you know what we're going to do? We're going to call all knowledges situated knowledges. There is no universal knowledge. We reject right out of the gate any claims to foundationalism, any claims to universalism. And hence, identity became the banner, a theorizing of the positionality of minorities. A way of saying to ourselves, you have the same experience as I do, let's march together. Let's call out the negative treatments of patriarchy, of xenophobia, of sexism, of apartheid. Let's insist that there are other ways of being in the world. And so the project of critique was foundational to identity politics, to identity. You know what critique does well is to call out, is to say, something's happening here. We are being treated unfairly. We insist that we have our equal due and we want to be treated fairly. So the interrogations of patriarchy, the interrogations of capitalism, the interrogations of these massive systems of oppression derive from these very, very precious contributions that we now steadily know as identity politics under the project of identity. But you see, nothing exists in the world that doesn't exist in tension with other things. And anytime you thrust your arm into the world reacts or responds. There isn't some neutral way to respond that doesn't have its own shadows as well. And I think what I'm getting to here is that even the project of identity has its own shadows. Notice that it has been foundational to how minorities have lived in a majoritarian world, in a world that insists that there is only one way to be alive, a monoculture of mind. Identity was our way of saying, no, we have a voice, we have experiences, we have a place. And yet, the nature of critique is such that it takes on the attributes of that which it wants to call out. Such is the nature of an entangled and processual and relational universe. That once I interact with something, or to use the terms of Karen Barad, to interact with something, um, we take on those features. We take on some of those properties. So critique, identity, identity politics needed to become the system in order to call out the system. It needed the same axiomatic, epistemological, ontological, spiritual, cosmological, mythological, archetypal. It needed the same place making lexicon, the same conceptual order. It needed the same arrangement of bodies in order to call out the mistreatment of minoritarian bodies. So this was the Faustian deal of resistance. Faustian deal of resistance. We had to situate ourselves in terms that are intelligible to a majoritarian culture. We had to situate ourselves as automatons. We had to take on the attributes of modernity. We had to become individuals, individual selves. And in doing so, we had to do away with some of the magic that is part of the world. The magic like something moving and something haunting a museum. Critique can only get us so far, you see. While vital, it's still encased within the order that it's trying to rehabilitate. And so that this tells me that identity is in a sense, the processual abandonment or the abandonment of our processual carnality in order for us to have a place in a stabilized or stabilizing world of modernity. So the strategy of identity, as these movements saw it, the strategy of identity is the rent we pay to live in a majoritarian world. Identity is how we pay rent. It's how we stake our claims. It's how we put our foot in the door and insist that we have a place at the table. But again, like I said, this self-referentiality is premised on a notion that we might, for conversational purposes, call a difference from. That is how identity plays out within modernity. I'm different from you. Hence, I name myself this way and insist on being seen. In an order that privileges this idea of difference from, something is lost. And that is the difference within. That is the order in which difference is not a negative attribute, not a space that needs to be filled, not a gap that exists between already stable bodies, but a processual interlinking of bodies that generates and undoes identity in the self-same instance. It's that flow that Yoruba shamans speak about, that flow that melts masks and vestigial flags and tables and desktops and pixels and colonizer and colonized, that flow that melts together, not forming some kind of uneven heap of oneness. I don't like to speak about oneness, but instead creates differences like the surface of a river or a body of water that is constantly generating patterns. That is this radical world of immanence that is lost by our resistance or not noticed. So here's what I write in my note, and I'd like to share it just like I wrote it here, that identity is the factoring out and performative denial of our processual immersion or entanglement with forces that exceed, generate, and undo the boundaries with which we mark ourselves as different from others. That might be a mouthful to take in. It's a factoring out. It's a performative stillness. And it's our only way, it used to be at least, our way of staking our ground. We needed to assert our place. And so it meant we dealt away with the magic that might be involved in being and becoming. And so
Bio,
today,
can you repeat that? Can you repeat that mouthful for us?
You want me to?
Yes, many people want you to.
Okay, I'll do that again. Identity is the factoring out and performative denial of our processual immersion or immersion. Pardon my accent. It's the factoring out and performative denial of our processual immersion or entanglement with agonistic forces, unmasterable forces that exceed, generate, and undo the boundaries with which we mark ourselves as different from others. It means that our edges are constantly being trafficked as contraband. It means our edges are never still, as modernity's conceit would have us believe. It means we're constantly being reworked and remade in ways that upset our language and the imperatives of our politics. It means we're constantly flowing, but we do not have rituals or rites of passage or ways of actually paying attention to that. And so I hope that's okay. I'll share my notes later. No problem with that. And so as I say here, that today our politics is almost entirely oppositional. Notice the genealogy of this. It's not that identity politics is bad in the ways that people speak about it, or it's bad, let's get rid of it. No, we need it. We need that critique. I was just reading the news and hearing how Black women, again, were the most generous with their votes in installing Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. And this tells me how Black bodies have been used over and over again. Ceaselessly consumed, but never digested. It's like Black and brown bodies of different kinds have been the condition of white modernity. So you can understand where it comes from. You can understand that you can understand the opposition, you can understand the resistance. I think what I'm getting at is the resistance came with costs, as everything does. And it meant losing a bit of our magic. And And this is where my concept of tricarcerality comes into play. I spoke about it in the last session. Tricarcerality involves three players: the oppressed, the oppressor, and the conceptual framework that grants meaning to their games or to their interaction. This is where the stockness of identity politics and identity comes in. That the oppressed enacts a politics of recognition. That's identity politics. We're holding the oppressor by his neck and saying, look at us, recognize me, my life matters. And that critique, like I said, is necessary. But you see, the oppressor, hope you know I'm using these terms in a way that isn't stable or stabilizing, and I'm going to get to that soon. You haven't explored the length and breadth of my philosophies yet, so just relax, okay? The oppressor is unable to grant recognition. And this is the dynamic that is at work. The oppressor cannot grant recognition because to do so would be thinking less of himself. It would take away from himself to grant recognition to the externalized, exoticized other. Which is why Zakia Iman Jackson, and I would recommend her book very much, Becoming Human, I think is the title of her book. This is why she writes that it's not like the slave masters didn't grant humanity to their slaves. They actually did. They included them into humanity, but they included them in a way that still positioned them at the bottom of the rung, closer to animality. The depraved aspects of humanity was what was granted, so that inclusion became a form of violence in itself. And Alexander Wehelia, another professor, speaks about how that binary of inclusion versus exclusion preserves the oppression, preserves the dynamics. And this is what I mean by tricarcerality, that as we hold the powers that be to account and we insist on being seen and recognized, the powers that be do not have any resources to hold the promiscuity of our bodies. And so it grants and says, yeah, we're gonna put you on our board. Representation matters, I must say, it matters. And at the same time, there are other bodies that are at work that queer and disturb representation. So that representation itself could be representation and inclusion within a paradigm of mastery, within a colonial paradigm. And like I said the other session, I don't want to have a front row seat on the Titanic. And I do not want an equal piece of a carcinogenic pie. So we're trapped then, we're trapped. The oppressor traps the oppressed. The oppressed is trapped by the oppressor. And both are trapped by the conceptual framework that holds them. White modernity is that conceptual framework. Liberal humanism, the dream of Laplace for determinism and control and human supremacy and the perpetuity of human beings. So we need counter-modern efforts. We need a different way, different language, a different way of speaking about these things that upsets it instead of feeds it. Because most of the time we're feeding into the same cyclicity, into the same Hegelian dynamic of stockness. It's like using red paint to mask a red wall. So where do we find the counter-modern? Let me give an example. And I wish I had a a picture of this guy. Donald Trump. I'm sorry if this is feeling very American-centric. Donald Trump comes to mind. I think many people would say Donald Trump is a racist. Donald Trump is a racist. How else would you account for the things he says, the politics of locking children in cages? He is a racist, we would say. Now, I want you to consider that statement for a little bit longer than usual. Instead of dismissing it as, of course, that's obvious, that he's a racist. Instead of doing that, I want you to stay with that statement just a while longer. Donald Trump is a racist. I've seen analysts on CNN speaking with White House spokespersons and saying, the president is a racist. Oh, no, he's not a racist. You haven't seen his heart. And the CNN or MSNBC speakers or analysts or experts do not know how to respond to that. Because, of course, their philosophy is that the idea of racism, or to be a racist, it has to be something from the heart. It's a humanist concept. So it's something essential to the human being. And they say something like, well, we can see the symptoms of his racism. And then the retort is, well, he has Black friends, so yeah, he's not a racist. And it's back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So I want you not to focus on whether it's true or not. I think truth is sometimes the affordance or the luxurious affordance of those who stand erect. And I think our times are inviting us to prostrate. And prostration is the pose or the posture of the fugitive who is stealing away from plantations. And to steal away is to have a different kind of relation with reality, with the world. So I'm not going to emphasize whether it's truth or not truth. I'm not going to emphasize or invite us to seek the veracity of that statement, whether Donald Trump is a racist. What I'm going to ask instead is invite us to think, what is happening here? What bodies or ideologies or discourses inform or make meaning or give meaning to this statement that Donald Trump is a racist? The first one that I have here is this: humanism. Race as a coherent physiological signifier or marker of social difference. Identity as stable, that the subject pre-exists his experience or her experience. My identity is always stable. And then lastly, healing might look something like critique or victory or cancellation or a political majority. Those are some things that are at work when we say, we don't usually talk about them, they're at work when we say that someone is a racist or someone is not a racist. But I think there are landmines when we get stuck there. Because I feel that race is a more than human happening. That race is territorial and nomadic. And that's not that we have race in the sense of being a property of my body, because that would centralize and privilege human bodies above ecologies and the worlds that make those bodies possible. It's not that race is a property stable in time, stable with identities. It's that race is territorial, ecological, physiological, moving, technological, that we're constantly moving and being deracialized and racialized in ways that our language has not been able to catch up to. This is what I call transraciality. And it's a post-humanist reframe of race, racism, racialization. What it seeks to do is to blast out these conversations from the very, very toxic humanist orbit in which we find ourselves encased in. What we want to do is to attend to flows and matrices and assemblages and libidinal sensuous events instead of atoms, instead of points. We listen to lines of flight. I don't have much time except to say this, that I feel that the assignment of the racist is actually an event in tricarcerality, not a property of the human being or a human being. That it's the network, it's the assemblage that creates the body, just like those things created these aliens that we saw today. It's the network that creates that. Once we lose sight of the atom and we notice the apparatus, not to dismiss the atom, not to say, I'm sure you're saying right now that Bayer, you're basically saying we don't hold those racists to account. We need to hold them accountable. And I know the pain of that in my bones, I tell you. But at the same time, maybe it's the fact, and these are the questions that we're enabled to ask, maybe it's the fact that the ways we respond to our pain proliferates our pain. There are other things that I want to get to, but there isn't time. I'm just going to read something too. I'm just going to read. This might take the next 5 minutes. How do we get rid of whiteness is the title of this piece that I haven't shared yet with anyone. I think in some ways that is the wrong question. How do we get rid of whiteness? Well, it is not wrong in the sense that there is a right question somewhere and that there is a moral order above us that preordains what ought to be the right question and what is self-evidently wrong. I mean this in a rhetorical sense. I mean to say that question usually sympathizes. The question, how do we get rid of whiteness, sympathizes with other considerations that affect us and can unfortunately reinforce our suffering. To ask, how do we get rid of whiteness or how do we dismantle whiteness presupposes we can. That whiteness is an attitude, a belief, perhaps a potentially rectifiable somatic condition. Ultimately, something very human. And so we strategize by designating whiteness as something within the power of the individual to master, to control, to bend. Addressing it from the individual perspective becomes a spectrum of responses and approaches that adopt the language of healing, of inner work, of spiritual transcendence, and possibly escape. Efforts which mostly lead to an infinite cyclicity of terms and policed scripts, locking in the pain for minoritarian bodies and increasing the despair of those people who have been trapped by virtue of their birth in a majoritarian culture. From the collective perspective, agency is invested in the systemic. In Supreme Courts and legislative houses, what we imagine we can do is that we can legislate whiteness out of existence. We can pass a bill, we can get rid of it, or we can install a post-racial president. But if we begin from the premise that whiteness is more than human, that it is memory, that it is alchemized in bacteria and bacterial biofilms, that it dwells in roots and tendrils, airborne with dust, living in unearthed bones, lingering in archetypes, a god asleep by the temple raised to worship him, the haunting absence of a nomadic Neolithic mother, holding her child safe from a storm in a cave, secreted in fecal deposits, caca, adrift with tender wood, a matter of traumatized land cuts and phantom trees haunting their charred stumps. If we think of whiteness not as white persons, but as a murmuration of bodies and networks that is always more than human, then new questions and responses suddenly feel possible, erupting from a post-humanist space. You might hear this and read this as an effort to downplay the troubles and occlusions and pain that the trope of whiteness has enacted and still does. What's that word again? Bypass. Yes, you might say that it excuses the racist instead of dealing him a fatal blow and damning him to hell. You might say that it dishonors your experience, your trauma, the suffering of our people, the zombification of our bodies, and the glorification of white bodies. I will hope instead that you come to see that I need to outthink whiteness, that decoloniality is not the denial of exclusion or the wholesale adoption of inclusion, but the reworking of where we are so that other kinds of moves are suddenly intelligible. If I capture my enemy within a concept of evil, both of us are detained in an arrangement of eternal opposition. If I vanquish my enemy in a game of sides, I have lost a part of myself. For you see, my ancestors and my children live in the cells of my oppressors. My decoloniality is a call to withdraw my plea for inclusion, to deny whiteness its ironic quest for transcendence by dissociation. Instead of how do we get rid of whiteness, which now seems hubristic, and privileges doing something above something doing, we are suddenly immersed in a radical order of immanence. We can then ask questions like, what can we touch? What is whiteness becoming? How is our pain locked into the ways we respond to pain? How do our analysis and identity categories entrap us in repeatable cycles that do not tell us what is emerging? How are white people changing? Which comes first, the offense or the politics that makes the offense intelligible? Let me end this way. I don't know what identity wants to be, what race might want to mutate into, what whiteness and might want to become. But I hear the sound of music and drumming not too far from here. And I wonder what's playing. And I wonder if these old feet might dance. Thank you.